reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. As Jesus and his disciples were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is to be handed over to men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were overwhelmed with grief. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the temple tax approached Peter and said, "Does not your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes," he said. When he came into the house, before he had time to speak, Jesus asked him, "What is your opinion, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take tolls or census tax? From their subjects or from foreigners?" When he said from foreigners, Jesus said to him, "Then the subjects are exempt. But that we may not offend them, go to the sea, drop in a hook, and take the first fish that comes up. Open its mouth, and you will find a coin worth twice the temple tax. Give that to them for me and for you." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
All right, congratulations everybody making it on time this morning for the earlier Mass. Appreciate you adjusting your schedules a little bit to be able to make Mass available for more of our parishioners. This morning we begin reading through the book of the prophet Ezekiel. And the prophet Ezekiel is not exactly one of the most, favorite books of most Christians. It's kind of a confusing book. It's kind of like the book of Revelation for the Old Testament, right? It's a book that is very confusing. In fact, ancient rabbis, they used to say that really people probably shouldn't even read the book of Ezekiel until they're about 50 years old, right? So they gain wisdom of the scriptures and wisdom of life. But Ezekiel is actually one of my favorite books of the Old Testament, just because, I kind of like those interesting, perplexing books. In fact, the book of Ezekiel is very much influential in understanding the book of Revelation. Part of the reason why so many people don't understand the book of Revelation is because they don't understand the book of Ezekiel. And mainly, one of the reasons why people don't understand the book of Ezekiel is because it is a vision that he had. And the vision that he had is full of symbols that many of us, we don't understand the symbols. They're very Jewish in nature, right? And most of us are not Jewish. So many of these symbols kind of go over our head. But like I said, Ezekiel is very influential on the book of Revelation. The structure of the book of Ezekiel actually basically mirrors the structure of the book of Revelation. To give you an idea of Ezekiel, he was a person who was living during the time of the exile, of the Old Testament, when the people of Jerusalem were carried off to Babylon, right? And eventually the temple was destroyed. So he was doing this at the very same time as Jeremiah. An easy way to remember the context of Jeremiah and Ezekiel is they both lived during the same time, except for Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem, right, the whole time. So he was there when the temple was burned to the ground, for example, right? And he saw everybody getting carried away in exile. Whereas Ezekiel, he was one of the first people to be taken over to Babylon. So he was living hundreds of miles away in exile, and he was having visions about what was taking place back in Jerusalem. It's very similar to St. John the Apostle in his vision of Revelation. Right? He was living in exile on the island of Patmos, and he was having visions about what was taking place in Jerusalem. And so they're very similar in that respect. Ezekiel was kind of like the original visionary of Revelation. And like I said, many of the symbols of the book of Ezekiel, they're perplexing. And so I just want to talk about one of the famous images that we heard about this morning. This is how the vision of Ezekiel begins, is that Ezekiel says that he was in exile by the river Chebar in Babylon. And of course, Ezekiel was very depressed, because he had been carried away in exile. The people of Israel, basically the Babylonians, were mocking God. They were mocking their religion. And so the people of Israel living in exile, they felt very defeated and like they had lost all hope, and they wondered what had happened to God. And in the midst of that hopelessness, Ezekiel has this vision. And he sees the heavens opened. And he sees this throne on wheels coming down from heaven. And the throne on wheels, it had many things that resembled the temple in Jerusalem. It had 4 living creatures who were holding it up. And each of those 4 living creatures had 4 different sets of wings. Even though it doesn't explicitly say it, this is saying that they were the cherubim, right? The angels that are always around the presence of God. The Ark of the Covenant in the Jerusalem temple, it was famously held up by the wings of cherubim. The golden statues that were built, and the wings holding up God's throne. So it was almost like Ezekiel was seeing that even though the temple in Jerusalem represents God's presence on earth, God's presence is not limited to the temple. The earthly temple is just a shadow of the heavenly reality. On this throne there was 4 living creatures, and each of them had forms that resembled humans, but they all had faces of different living creatures. One of them had the face of a lion, the other had a face of an ox, the other the face of an eagle, and the fourth the face of a human. Again, you might remember this from the book of Revelation. In the book of Revelation, these 4 living creatures appear again, or sometimes if you go into different churches, sometimes the artwork you will see around the sanctuary in the church, you'll see those 4 living creatures. The early Christians, they used to compare them to the 4 gospel writers, but in the original context, this was representing God's power and majesty, right, over all of creation. Because the lion is basically the most powerful of all wild creatures. The ox is the most powerful of all domestic, right, creatures. Human beings are the kings of all of creation. Right? We rule the world. The eagles rule the skies, right, of all things that fly. So it's representing God's power and majesty. Then as Ezekiel is about to hear God's voice, he hears the sound of the wings of the cherubim. Think of like a helicopter or an airplane or something like that, right? It just overwhelms you with the power of its sound, the roaring of the mighty waters. Right? Think about the times where you've been to different waterfalls and you're just overwhelmed by the power of the water. Right? All of this is supposed to be symbolic to Ezekiel, that even though it seems like everything has been lost for Israel, God still sits on his throne, and he is still completely in power and in control. His power has not been diminished in any way. And the last thing I'll say about this is that when I was in Noblesville, they had this really neat chalice, right, from the church. And the chalice, on the handle, it actually had these 4 living creatures on it. Right? And I always thought that was really beautiful, right? That the throne of God is held up by these 4 living creatures. That's what we see in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. And that nowadays, right, the throne of God, that every chalice used at Mass is like another throne. So this chalice in Noblesville represented that. Every time we come to Mass, it's almost like we're having another vision of Ezekiel. The heavens are open for us, and God comes down on his throne, which is the Eucharist. And he gives himself to us. And even though sometimes it may be difficult to see his power and what he is doing, he is among us, and he is mighty in power. And he comes to us even in the times where we feel like we are living in our own kind of exile.